Darklings. So I know a couple of years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, I ended up doing a Dracula video, and I figured that I was going to redo that a little bit. So I have a very interesting love-hate relationship with Dracula. So this book, I read the beginning of it probably 5 times before I finally succeeded in making it all the way through. It's roughly 400 pages. The pacing is really weird. The writing styles are not terribly consistent, which most people can kind of just sum up to the fact that it's told through journals. And continuity is negotiable. So this book is very heavily flawed. That being said, it's kind of a pulp novel and ended up having immediate popularity upon its release in 1897. But there is a lot of things that Bram Stoker drew from in order to write this. While nowadays it is exceptionally easy to come across information about vampires, mostly because of this book, this piece of fiction, written by an Irishman who had never been to Eastern Europe, it's kind of interesting to think that we base all of our concepts of vampirism off of this book. So a really good way that I ended up finding more about the information, and I've brought this book up before, is Dracula's Guest, a connoisseur's collection of Victorian vampire stories edited by Michael Sims. So this has a bunch of different short stories that are from the Victorian era, and it even has little blurbs at the beginning of each chapter talking about how it ties into Dracula and its relation to it. So this was a good jumping point for some research on why Dracula's a bit of a mess. Of course, short vampire fiction has always been popular. This is another recent book find, Dracula's Brood, Vampire Classics by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, M.R. James, and others, selected and introduced by Richard Deloy. This is another example. So, amongst the authors that influenced Bram Stoker's research includes Emily Gerard, who was an English woman who ended up marrying a Hungarian count and was convinced that she knew everything about the region, even though she really didn't. Which is the main reason why we have the fake word Nosferatu. People think it's a real word, and it's not, because she kind of messed things up. Apparently, supposedly, the word is similar to a Hungarian word that means witch or demon, but absolutely does not mean vampire because, excuse my bad pronunciation, upir or vampire is a lot closer to the original term for vampire in that province or area or whatever. If you want to know more about how we come up with a lot of our supposed mythology for vampires and how they came about, Vampires, Burial, and Death, Folklore and Reality by Paul Barber is a really good read. I mean, it's very well fact-checked, and there's a lot of research involved, including a lot of the Serbian and Far Eastern European belief systems that inspired modern vampires, long before we thought of them as how we do now. If you want to know more about Vlad Tepes or Vlad III, the Prince of Wallachia, the historian, while fictional and ends up having more of a supernatural lean towards the end of it, does have a lot of really good research if you want to know more about said prince. Because there's also a lot of heavy speculation that Bram Stoker didn't really even know that Vlad III was even in that area. And if he did, he only knew him by name, but didn't know about the whole impaling thing. This is also a good place to start if you want to know more about Bram Stoker's Trail of Blood. Who was Dracula? Jim Steinmeyer. This is a rather interesting background on his process for writing it too, including some of the stuff about his friend Henry James, who was an actor and was the main inspiration for the appearance of Dracula within his novel. I haven't had the chance to read this one, though I've had it for some time. This is Sundays with Vlad, Paul Babu, From Pennsylvania to Transylvania, One Man's Quest to Live in the World of the Undead. Also, if you want to know more about the film aspect, The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror by David J. Schall is a really good place to start. He is a very renowned horror historian, had interviews with people who even were in the film production of Dracula from 1931, and he seriously knows his stuff. So, on to the film stuff, because I talk about movies a lot. Yes, this DVD copy is a little bit weird, but this is 1922's Nosferatu. There are still people in this world that, one, have never heard of this movie, as evidenced by someone who pointed at my Nosferatu tattoo in a coffee shop. It was very comical. Two, this has a music video for Typo Negative's Black No. 1, which is a bonus since I love that band. And three, this film was done illegally. Count Dracula was changed to Count Orlok, and they still were sued by Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, and were ordered to destroy all copies of the film because it was copyright infringement, because in 1922, Dracula was not public domain. So the only reason why we have it today, it was considered a lost film until the 1960s, is that it was found in some vaults in Argentina and Brazil. I think there were 8 copies left, even though all copies in the US and Europe were destroyed. It's the only reason we have this movie around. It's a very interesting one. Otherwise, I do suggest watching Shadow of the Vampire after you've watched this, because that's a fun one and I forgot to bring it in my pile. So for the 1931 Todd Browning Dracula with Bela Lugosi, David Manners, and I believe Helen Chandler, this is kind of interesting because a lot of people think that this is what the book is like, and it's not. This is based off of the stage production that originally ran, I believe, from 1922 to 1925, and that stage play took a lot to write. There were a lot of hiccups with getting that thing written and getting permission from Florence Stoker, because the majority of her money was tied up with the royalties for Dracula, which was kind of the only thing she had after her husband's death. So, this is based off of the stage play. There were a lot of things shifted around, such as Renfield was the one that went to Transylvania as the solicitor instead of Jonathan Harker. And they also changed a lot of the interactions. It is interesting that they chose a Hungarian actor after Lon Chaney fell through due to his untimely death. And it's considered a very classic film, despite the stilted acting, the lack of music that leads for some confusing pacing, and some ridiculous nature of the script. It's still a classic. I still love this film, and everybody should see it, especially if you like horror movies in the slightest. It's very clever. Dwight Fry, who plays Renfield, has a very outlandish performance that does him very, very well, even if it led to his typecasting. I have also talked about Son of Dracula and Dracula's Daughter in a recent video, or a few recent videos, so I won't go into depth, but if you want continued Universal messing around with the story, I do suggest that. Otherwise, the next time that you get Dracula on screen properly, excusing Universal, you end up in the Hammerverse with Christopher Lee. This was his first big breakthrough. He played the titular vampire more than 10 times. This is just 4 of those times. In some respects, while it strays farther from the book, there are some aspects that feel more like the book to me. In the first one, Horror of Dracula from 1958, which was Terence Fisher's big breakthrough as a director and Hammer's big moneymaker, which was doing Dracula in Technicolor. If you want further Christopher Lee Dracula goodness, there is also Dracula Prince of Darkness, and very loosely, The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Otherwise, Brides of Dracula, which is in this box set, is not featuring Dracula at all, and still interesting. To rather completely abandon all pretense of paying attention to the original story of Dracula, there is Paul Morrissey's Blood for Dracula, also billed as Andy Warhol's Dracula. This is just a 70s campy romp, and Udo Kier as Dracula, a very pathetic, ailing little man. This is a comical piece of trash, and I only suggest watching it if you really like 70s pulp cinema and Andy Warhol short films. Otherwise, this very atmospheric, highly gothic adaptation from 1979, also based off of the 70s play Revival, with set design by Edward Gorey, for those who love his work, with Frank Langella. This is also a treat. This, in some respects, has a lot of atmospheric tones that are more similar to the book. That came out in the same year and has a lot of interesting nods to the book now that Dracula was public domain, is Nosferatu, the Vampire, or Phantom der Nacht, depending if you're watching the German or the English version. So, this is admittedly the only Werner Herzog film I've seen, and it's really good. It's broody, it's atmospheric, Isabella Adjani is a very beautiful Mina. I highly suggest watching that, even though in general I'm kind of iffy about remakes. If you want to see Dracula in full form, character-wise, and he's kind of this figure from your childhood nightmares. He's that vision that the monster kids all have. The Monster Squad from 1987 is totally worth the ride. This Dracula is considered one of the greatest characterizations of the character, and I highly recommend it. The closest to accurate adaptation to the book is Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman as Dracula, Winona Ryder, Keanu Reeves, Tom Waits as Renfield. This one's highly stylized. The costumes are by Iko Ishioka, who is amazing. May she rest in peace. And this is both trash and brilliant cinema at the same time. This is one of those films that both is good and is not, but it is a lot closer to the novel than any other previous adaptation. Amazingly, you can get shitty movie packs on eBay for $5, and the only one on here that's really, well, there's two on here, I guess, that are worth watching, which is The Satanic Rites of Dracula and Daughter of Darkness. Daughter of Darkness is a 1990 TV movie with Mia Sara and Anthony Perkins, and it has vague connections to the actual Dracula story. Otherwise, this is a piece of campy trash. I mostly like it because even though it's really stupid, I still think it's very funny. And Mel Brooks is one of my favorite directors. So this is negotiable. A lot of people think it's awful. I still think it's very funny. It mostly pokes a lot of fun at the stiffness of British aristocracy, especially in Victorian times. And then Leslie Nielsen plays a rather ridiculous Dracula. This movie is admittedly awful. A lot of late 90s, early 2000s trash is what I will watch when it comes to that meta-awareness horror film. The idea of Gerard Butler being Dracula is really weird. It's trying too hard to be stylish and therefore doesn't make any sense. But the idea of who Dracula in this adaptation is, when it comes to a rather biblical connection, is interesting. And I haven't seen it before, so I have to give it props. Now, Dracula Untold, which came out, I think, 3 years ago, with Luke Evans as Dracula, is a very interesting one because it takes bits and pieces of historical fact about Vlad III and his trying to protect his people from the Turkish invasions. And the costume detailing is really good. It's not necessarily completely accurate, of course, but it is still interesting to incorporate some historical aspects in with the fiction. So Dracula is a mess. I love it. I respect it. It's not the best piece of vampire fiction out there. I know that there is a modern adaptation, continuation, whatever, that I read in middle school. I actually haven't read since, and I'm surprised I still have this book. But Bloodline by Kate Carey is kind of amusing and is a continuation. I think it has sequels, but I'm not really sure. Anyway, for my fellow Dracula fans, hopefully you have some additional feedback for me. If I really wanted to nitpick Dracula, I could go on for a few more hours based solely off of Hungarian, Serbian, and Romanian burial rites, but I don't have the time to do that today. Till next time, Darklings.